Hello and welcome to Unsourced Wall. My name is Elvis, and as always, I'm your host. Okay, so this is going to be kind of a short one because there's not a lot to go into this week, but let's try to make the best of it. First off, we have some movie news. Well, really the only movie topic that seemed any interesting is that we have the first on-set photos from Suicide Squad 2, and we have a bunch of characters in costume, and I have to say, I like the aesthetic of the first movie better because it seemed like things that people in that kind of situation and for who they were would actually wear. Just regular clothing that came together to approximate some sort of uniform or outfit or costume. This seems very parody-esque. They're in very bright pastel neon costumes that have very foam texture looks to them. And it doesn't seem like it's meant to be an actual costume that they put work into, but more something that's meant to be a joke and is probably signaling that they're gonna die painfully and horribly really soon. And that's a shame because there's a huge cast of characters that are gonna be put into this one. And I don't want to see Peacemaker go out there with something that is meant to be laughable, just there for a silly sight gag about how, goofy superhero costumes are. So, fingers crossed, but these first set photos aren't really that hope-inducing. Moving on to TV news, we have probably the most interesting one is that James Wan is going to be creating for television a Dylan Dog TV show. Now, if you don't know, Dylan Dog is a long-running European comic about a supernatural investigator who gets into all sorts of hijinks, especially with his sidekick who is a pastiche of Groucho Marx, and basically having to do a lot with his love life and all sorts of drama and gags therein. It's been running for several hundred issues now and seems to have no end in sight. There was a previous American adaptation called Dylan Dog Dead of Night starring Brandon Routh, Sam Huntington, and I think Tate Higgs, and it transplanted at least the title character into a much more generic and by the book supernatural action comedy, and it's resoundingly seen as one of the worst things ever done to a foreign adaptation. So fingers crossed for James Wan. If anyone can do it, I think that he's probably one of the more trusted horror filmmakers right now, so best of luck to him. And secondly, for TV news, apparently the DC Universe app put up a poll for whether or not Jason would die or live in the latest episode of Titans. And a bunch of people got really mad because they thought that it was feasible for Titans Season 2 to have shot two entirely different second halves of Season 2, depending on this poll. And so they felt like either the integrity of Season 2 was in jeopardy or the career and livelihood of the actor playing Jason Todd, Curran Walters, was in jeopardy. And it was probably the most intense uproar I've seen for a while, and it's pretty hilarious. I'm glad that at the very least, by the end of this recording, it's all been passed by. And there's not much else in comic news, so let's move on to what I read this week. First off, we have Hawkman number 17, and it turned out exactly like I expected. Something that should have been a heavy character arc that drew from everything that had been set up in previous issues ended up being turned into shoddy fodder for a weekly strung together event. And it's kind of ridiculous, not just because it could have dovetailed a whole lot more elegantly than it ends up doing, but just because of how blunt and awkwardly it's shoved in. You have a trio of issues where Hawkman has to confront some of his more aggressively evil past and how he's, handling this new incarnation of Shadow Thief and whether or not he's going to cross a line. But instead of actually dealing with that and letting that be, something that leads into Hawkman's own downfall into his infected status for this event, you just have him go out and say, oh no, something's infected me. And then a panel later, he's grown a whole new helmet, dreads, and a corset, and he's just full on evil now. It just sort of throws everything out the window for something that could have been done 3 issues ago, rather than waste the time pretending you're going to ask questions and then also pretending that you have any intention of answering them. I'll stick around for the next few issues because they're bringing in Shayera to pick up the slack as the new protagonist for this arc, but there really has been a huge decline for this series, and I wonder if it'll survive because ongoings like this, like third string ongoings, they really live or die by events because you're going to be putting off a lot of people who are really invested in this book, and the moment the event comes in and crashes everything around it, who's really going to be sticking by when the dust has settled? And I'm worried about this for this book. I really am. So I hope it does get to finish this season out, and I hope there's a season 3 that is able to again reach the heights of season 1. Because there was some definite really peak moments for Hawkman there, and I know this series can do better. So overall, 1 thumb down, 1 thumb middle. And the only other thing I read this week was Powers of X number 6. I finally caught up with both House of and Powers of X right in time for this finale, and well, it was a hell of a ride. It took all my expectations of what Hickman was going to do with this property and turned it slightly askew. Not upside down, not entirely, but it played with what I felt were Hickman's cliches and hallmarks just enough to give it a refreshing quality that caught me off guard. After the back half of his Fantastic Four and all of his Avengers run, I kind of thought this would fill the same niche of being a fill-in-the-blank checklist of a story, something that gives the structure of the narrative more importance and attention than how the narrative is really being told. But while that is certainly the case, House and Powers threw enough surprises onto the pile that it kept me on my toes. And the checklist here is more ambiguous and hypothetical than anything else. It's almost an intentional rebuke of how Avengers began by telling you exactly how it's going to end, and then just does it again and again, leading to a really glacial read. This, by comparison, does something akin to telling you a whole bunch of lies of how it might end, and then teases you that one might be the truth, if you get what I mean. House and Powers was fun, clinical, full of Hickman's actually entertaining world-building tricks that sometimes give you the middle finger, and you just love how just sort of crass and just ambitious it is. And I hope the series that spin off from this keep up that momentum. It honestly has me so excited to see exactly where this is going to branch out from, and I hope that doesn't disappoint because it does hit the ground running. So overall, 2 thumbs up. Heading into what I watched this week, we have Titans Season 2, Episode 6, Connor. This was an okay episode. For an introduction episode, it was as good as it could have been. The actor that got to play Connor sells it as much as he can, and it was interesting to see how they integrated parts and pieces of his backstory into the plot of the episode. Things like using the alcoholic drunk angle from Secret Origins with this version of Lionel Luthor, or going wild with Mercy Graves and the previous Superboy clones. It was nice and dramatic to see how Connor reacted and interacted with everyone and everything around him, and how the impact for him was either better or for worse. That's where the episode really shines, because it tries to hammer home that Connor had this wide-eyed view of the world that is kind of being tempered and twisted by his own Luthor genes, and it has this really engaging, conflicted effect with him. In fact, it's so engaging to just see Connor walk around Metropolis or head out to Smallville just to see how he makes his way through these scenes. But when his path crosses with the main plot and the actual sort of backstory with the scientist who created him, the episode just shifts toward bleakly expositing everything around him. It loses steam, and the scientists themselves is just off-putting and honestly not that interesting. The episode doesn't become boring, but it becomes uneasy, and not really in a way that intrigues or invites deeper viewing. There's just this cold sterility to it all that undercuts how, entertaining and lofty and honestly ambitious the early Connor scenes were. So it's a shame. The episode does leave things off at an interesting intersection with the main Titans story, but like I said last week, we're now in the back half of this season, and it needs to start getting things to gear, because if it doesn't, it's just going to be more flatlining. So overall, 2 thumbs middle. And lastly, we have this week's special Unsourced Wall Halloween Blowout Review. The winner of this week's poll was The Crow, so let's just get right on to that. There's a few things I want to get off my chest off the bat. This movie, as it is, has aged really well. If you take it for the early 90s flick that it really can't escape being, it still holds a rather special quality. Pretty much all of the core cast of actors are giving it everything they got. From Ernie Hudson as this pitch-perfectly curmudgeonly Officer Albrecht, to Sarah, Eric and Shelley's would-be ward, played by Rochelle Davis, and even to Brendan Lee himself as Eric, who was just so affable, charming, and just outright adorable at times. It's that whenever either of those three is on screen, being given actual hefty character scenes and dialogue to really revel in, the movie is at its best. These three do a great job towing the line between the film's strangely enforced mood and aesthetic, and providing something to really latch onto, immerse, and engage and relate with. Because if I have to start getting into some of my less favorable opinions here, it's that the tone, the mood, and the aesthetic of the movie, while unique and honestly one of the most eye-catching and unforgettable, pieces of this film, is that it can sometimes get to being too much and actually start letting the characters, actors, and story down. That's why I specified that the highlights of this movie are the slower and paced, character-driven moments. Scenes like Sarah interacting with Albrecht, her mother, Fun Boy, the bartender, or even Eric himself post-Crowaning, and Eric's back and forths with Albrecht after killing Tintin in the street or back in his apartment. Bits and pieces that add as much levity as they do drama, and the somber sense of tragedy and trauma. It's really those two, Sarah and Eric, that carry the movie on their backs by being able to provide both a wry or buoyant outlook that is clearly there to obscure and mask some deeper trauma, anxiety, or scarring. It's really well handled by both actors, and when the masks for both drop, the impact hits hard. It's especially apparent in subtler moments, such as when Sarah hurriedly tries to make amends with her mother after instinctively rebuffing her a couple of times in a single scene. It's reflexive and learned behavior, and the way it's acted by Rochelle Davis is just so potent. I love stuff like that. It really just cut right to the bit of it, and I just felt so much in that scene for these characters and for what the movie was trying to say about them. It was honestly pretty perfect and might be my favorite scene in the entire movie. It's when the movie loses sight of that, which is pretty often, that I start to kind of glaze over. I could go on all day with the differences between the comic and the movie, because there are dozens. But the stuff that stayed the same were really almost all of the core things, like showing the effects of slum living on the innocent, like Sarah, who does have a slight counterpart in the comic, or the downtrodden and burnt out efforts of police officers, like Albrecht, or his counterpart in the comic, Captain Hook, who also become immersed in Eric's rampage and how they have to handle that. And Eric himself, a half-dead vigilante who sways to and fro between manic fits and unassailable and impenetrable sadness, mainly due to very loving memories that can send him into an almost seizure-like fit. All well done by the movie for the most part, although Eric's manicness is made into a slightly more standard protagonistic personality, but the elements still exist. Yet it's the remainder of the core that the movie adds in such insane differences that weaken the impact of the overall product. Stuff like some very obvious gags and setups that take away from the emotional resonance because they're just so blunt and in your face, and it's almost like you're being hit over the head, and it's just really either too goofy or too condescending for words. Then you also have things like Top Dollar now being a crime kingpin whose only export and business seems to be arson. Like organized arson. That's as much as we ever get to know about his grasp on a city. I don't even think that they do anything to buildings. I think they tried to set up that it was some sort of real estate thing, but even in the backstory, we know 100% for sure that he's not doing anything with the abandoned and burnt out buildings anyway. So it just makes it seem like just another random thing, just make him even more evil and mustache twirling, and it's just too much. It's just too much. But even if that was the line, the movie again crosses it by having him have an Asian half-sister who he engages in orgies with, and also some weird backstory for the Crow's spirit powers that the movie makes up and reiterates like 3 times because it's meant to be deep, but instead it's just too ridiculous. It's just a bunch of stuff like that that keeps it from being as interesting and as intimate feeling, because it veers off into crazy town, and the disconnect because of all this hits the audience right in the face. It's like it's trying to have its cake and eat it too, trying to be the slower, dramatic, emotional journey, and also just being a silly 90s action movie that has things like a goon who has a campy gimmick about how he only throws knives, and Eric doing the thing that every early comic book movie street level hero did, where the hero draws his logo in flames on the ground. I actually think The Crow was the movie that did it first, but that doesn't make it any better. It's just so out of place, and so much of this movie is out of place. Not all of it is bad though. David Patrick Kelly as T-Bird is so delightfully entertaining despite all the changes, and Eric's retribution for him is just so silly, so goofy, so ridiculous, but it is just too good. And I had such a riot during that scene. It was amazing and just one of the best things that they came up with. But that's really the exception for most of these scenes. All of these put together are nothing that really breaks the movie, because it fits really well into the mold of this subgenre, and it does it better than most of the other movies that did it, or the movies that copied it. But what it does do negatively is that it keeps the story from reaching greater heights, and it really could have. You have actors who could have really penetrated the depths of the comic. You have a director who could have really made that work on screen, and who could have really tapped into the heavy-hitting emotional quantity of it too. But what you get is just a really silly movie that sometimes is really, really hard-hitting. So what you end up with is something that just hits it right in the middle, and it could have been something so much more unique and expressive, and I wish that it was. I really do. As it stands, it's a really watchable movie. The goofiness can be jarring, but fun in its own sake, and the strong performances stay strong all the way throughout. And that's really the main selling point here anyway. It's what a Crow movie should have. If it weren't for that, then there'd be really nothing to this movie, because that's what makes it special. And I'm glad that at least it has that memorable aspect to it, because that's what's going to keep bringing you back to this. And I'm glad I rewatched it so I could, relearn that for myself, because now I have a great new respect for it, at least for those moments, and for those characters, and for those actors. Besides, it also has a gearing up montage set to The Cure, and how can you really go against that? Overall, 1 thumb up, 1 thumb middle. I give it a number score of 7.5 out of 10. Anyway, that was really fun to go back and to revisit The Crow, and I'm so glad it won this week's poll. I can't wait to see what wins next week. Anyway, we have no question this week because I even forgot to put out the call for questions. So I just want to say thank you so much to anyone out there who's ever sent in a question, comment, or topic. It means so much to me, and I am just so grateful for that. So thank you for making this such a great time. And I just want to say that if anyone out there has their own question, comments, or topics, you can always find me on Twitter at THE_SNICKMAN. And we'll give a shout out to cover artists for the show at DOTEMCEE. Please check them out. They're amazing. And please give them all the traction you can give because they really deserve it. And thank you for listening this week. I had a great time. Have a great week. And see you then.